wind had teeth and it was chewing the world down to the bone. For 3 days, the woman had walked into that wind, fueled by a fear that burned colder than the snow. Now, the fear was gone, replaced by a hollow, floating numbness. The world had shrunk to the gray swirl of ice in her face and the agonizing weight of her own limbs. She had left the river valley, climbing into the high lonesome of the Montana mountains, knowing only that she had to get away from the flatlands, from the tracks, from the towns. She had followed a game trail until it vanished. She had eaten the last of her stolen, frozen bread a lifetime ago. Now, she was eating the cold. Her feet were no longer her own. They were blocks of wood, heavy and distant, wrapped in rags and ruined boots. When her left leg punched through the snow crust, her body followed with a terrible, slow finality. She did not have the strength to pull herself out. She lay there, breathing in ragged, painful clouds, watching the snow sift down over her arms. It was only then, as her vision began to dim to a pinprick, that she saw the line. It was a fence, not wire, but tall, upright posts of pine, stark and dark against the gray. It was the first straight line she had seen in days. It meant a person. It meant a place. A desperate animal surge of energy moved her. She did not know how she got to her feet. She clawed her way, stumbling, falling, rising again. Her hands, frozen into claws, scraped against the rough wood. She gripped the top rail, a solid, impossible thing in a world of drift and air. She tried to call out, to scream for help. A sound like a dry leaf scraping stone came from her throat. The hunger, the cold, and the exhaustion converged. The fence line blurred. The gray world tilted and then went black. She collapsed at the edge of the snowy clearing, a discarded pile of rags against the tall wooden fence, and did not move. Elias Thorne did not like the sound of the wind. It was a hungry sound. He measured his life by the wood pile, and this wind meant the pile needed to be higher. He stood in the lee of his cabin, the heavy double-bit axe rising and falling in a rhythm that was steady as his own heart. The air was so cold the pine round split with a clean, sharp crack, a sound that died instantly in the muffled air. He worked through the morning, stacking the wood, his mind quiet. He had come to this mountain 8 years prior to escape the noise of the world, the noise of memory. Here, there was only the work. He stopped, mid-swing, his senses sharpened by solitude. Caught something wrong. It was not a sound, it was a shape. Through the shifting curtain of snow, he saw a patch of color, a darkness, slumped against his fence line. Maybe 50 yards distant. It was too small for a bear, too still for a deer. He thought perhaps a wolf, caught in a drift. He lowered the axe, his face grim. He would not abide wolves this close to his stock, small though it was. He moved from the shelter of the cabin, the wind hitting him like a physical blow. He pulled his collar higher, his eyes fixed on the shape. As he drew closer, the shape resolved. It was not an animal, it was a person. He broke into a heavy, ground-eating run, his boots plunging into the drifts. He reached the fence and stared, his mind struggling to accept the sight. It was a woman, her face buried in the snow, her hair frozen in icy mats to the wood. Her dress was summer-weight calico, torn and useless. Her boots split open. She was so still, so pale. She looked as if she had been part of the snow for a month. There was no hesitation. Elias was a man who acted. The world was brutal, and thought was a luxury that cost lives. He did not call to her. He simply unhooked her frozen fingers from the rail, the skin tearing slightly. He slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back. When he lifted her, a soft, involuntary grunt of surprise left him. She weighed nothing. She was a bundle of sticks, a child's weight. He had hauled deer carcasses that felt heavier. He turned his back to the wind, shielding her small frame with his own, and began the heavy walk back to the cabin. He kicked the door open and carried her inside. The sudden warmth of the cabin was a shock. the air thick with the smell of pine smoke, dried herbs, and the faint, metallic tang of his traps. His home was one room, Spartan and clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a bed frame built into another, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and shelves stacked with tins and tools filled the rest of the space. It was a fortress of solitude. He carried her past the fire and laid her gently on his own cot, the ropes creaking under the sudden, tiny burden. She did not stir. Her breathing was a shallow, alarming whisper. He moved with purpose. First, he stoked the fire, throwing 2 heavy logs onto the embers. The flames caught, roaring up the chimney, and a wave of dry heat rolled into the room. He lit the oil lamp, chasing the gray afternoon shadows from the corners. Then, he turned back to her. He worked gently, but without ceremony. Her boots were frozen solid. He took his skinning knife and carefully cut the ruined leather and the rags beneath, freeing her feet. He swore, low and soft. At the sight, her skin was a waxy, bluish white, the toes blackened. He removed her soaked, frozen dress, cutting the laces with the same knife, his jaw tight. He did not linger. He kept his eyes on the task. He covered her immediately with a heavy, dry wool blanket, tucking it tight around her chin. Then he went to the hearth and pulled down the thickest of his cured bear pelts, laying the massive weight over her. He chafed her hands between his own, his rough palm scraping her icy skin, trying to force life back into them. He kept the fire roaring. He melted snow in the big kettle and added a spoonful of bouillon and some dried venison jerky, letting it simmer down into a thin, strong broth. He poured some into a tin mug. He sat on the edge of the cot and lifted her head. "Miss," he said. His voice was rough, rusted from disuse. Her eyelids fluttered. They were caked with ice. She tried to pull away, a weak, reflexive motion, a deeper terror moving beneath the surface of her near-death state. "You're safe," he said. It was not a comfort, just a fact. "You need to drink this." He held the mug to her lips. She flinched at the metal, at his touch, a tremor that ran through her whole body, but she was too weak to resist. He tipped the mug, letting a tiny amount of the hot, salty broth slide into her mouth. She choked, then swallowed, a painful, desperate spasm. He fed her slowly, with the great patient care of a man who knew how to handle frightened, wounded things. He fed her broth 1 spoonful at a time, for what felt like an hour, until the mug was empty and a faint, fragile trace of color had returned to her lips. She did not speak. She only watched him, her eyes wide with a terror that the cold had not managed to extinguish. When he was done, he set the mug aside, pulled a chair near the cot, and sat down. He didn't sleep. He watched her breathe, and he fed the fire. Days passed. The storm raged, sealing the cabin in a world of white. Then the storm broke, and the world was a blinding, brilliant blue and white, the sun sharp on the snow. The woman slept. It was a sleep so deep it was close to death, a body sinking into itself to heal. Elias tended her. He cleaned her frostbitten feet with whiskey and wrapped them in clean rags. He made oatmeal and thinned it with water, feeding it to her when she woke, which was rare. She drifted in and out, her eyes flickering to him, then to the door, then closing again. On the 4th day, the fever came. She thrashed, crying out words he could not understand, her body radiating a dry heat. He bathed her face with snow water, holding her down when the shaking grew too violent. He sat by her cot for 2 nights straight, forcing water between her cracked lips, wondering if he had pulled her from the snow only to watch her die by the fire. Then, on the 6th morning, the fever broke. He woke in his chair to find her watching him. Her eyes were clear. The terror was still there, but it was banked, like embers beneath ashes. He rose and went to the hearth, his movements slow, deliberate. He ladled stew into a bowl. He did not offer to feed her. He set it on the small stool beside her cot, with a spoon. She pushed herself up on one elbow. The effort left her trembling, her breath coming fast. Her eyes darted to the spoon, then to him. He had moved away, his back to her, checking the action on his rifle. He gave her the decency of not watching her weakness. He heard the clink of the spoon against the bowl. It was a slow, unsteady sound. When he turned back, the bowl was half empty, and she was asleep again. The next time she woke, she spoke. Her voice was a dry rasp, a sound of ruin. "Where?" "Montana Territory," he said, not turning from the wood he was carving. "My claim. You're safe." She was silent for a long time. He could feel her gaze on his back. My name is Clara." He nodded. He kept carving. He did not ask her for the rest. He did not ask how she came to be freezing to death at his fence line, dressed in rags, weighing less than a sack of flour. The mountains were full of people who had run from something. Asking a name was a courtesy. Asking for a story was a violation. He didn't press for more. Her strength returned by agonizing, slow degrees. First, she was able to sit up for an hour. Then, 2, a week after he brought her in, she stood. She wobbled like a newborn colt, her hand gripping the cot, her face pale with the effort. Elias gave her space. He had moved his own bedroll to the floor by the hearth, giving her the cot. He went about his days as he always had. He rose before the sun, made coffee, and went out to check his trap lines. He would return mid-morning, skin and prep any game, chop wood, and cook their one main meal in the afternoon. He was a man of deep, ingrained routine. At first, she just watched. She sat on the cot, the heavy pelt wrapped around her, her eyes following his every move. He had found an old, mended wool shirt of his and a pair of trousers, and left them for her. They were comically large, but they were warm. As she regained her legs, she began to help. It started simply. She took the bowls to the wash basin. Then, one day, while he was outside, he returned to find she had swept the floor with his rough broom. Another day, she was folding his blankets. They fell into a rhythm of silence and survival. Their days were measured by chores. He would bring in a rabbit. She would take it when he was done, stewing the meat until it fell from the bone. He would mend a harness. She would sit by the fire, mending the endless holes in his socks, her stitches small and neat. They rarely spoke. Words seemed loud, unnecessary. He would nod at the water bucket. She would put on his heavy coat, which swallowed her whole, and make the trip to the creek. She would set a plate of food on the table. He would nod his thanks. It was a partnership forged in necessity, existing entirely in the small, warm space of the cabin. But she was not at peace. She was a wild thing, cornered and cautious. Elias noticed. She was wary, always scanning the exits. She never sat with her back to the door. When he entered the cabin, she would start. A small, violent jump, her hands flying to her throat, until she saw it was him. Loud noises were the worst. The sudden crack of a log settling in the fire would make her drop whatever she was holding. One afternoon, he was outside splitting kindling, and the axe head struck a knot with a sharp clang that echoed in the cold air. He heard a clatter from inside. He hurried in, finding her pressed against the far wall, a tin plate on the floor, her eyes wide and blank with terror. She was breathing in short, shallow gasps. He stopped, holding his hands up slightly, as if calming a horse. "Just the axe, Clara," he said, his voice low. "Just the wood." She did not seem to hear him. It took a full minute for her breathing to slow, for her eyes to focus on him. She looked down at the plate, humiliated, and bent to pick it up. I'm sorry," she whispered. "No need," he said. It was a sharp sound. After that, he made his movements quieter. He closed the door softly. He set his tools down gently. He was learning her pain without ever asking its name. One morning, The light was bright, streaming in the single window and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She was at the table, grinding coffee beans, her head bowed. The simple domestic act was so normal it struck Elias. He stopped by the hearth, a log in his hand, and just watched her. He watched the line of her neck, the way her two large shirts slipped off one shoulder, revealing the pale skin beneath. He saw the bruises that were only now fading, dark shadows on her collarbone. He saw the raw, chapped skin of her hands, healing but still scarred. She was so thin, a bird in a blizzard, and yet she was here. She had survived the fence. She had survived the fever. She was grinding coffee. His gaze softened. It was not desire. It was something deeper, something he had not felt in years. It was a quiet, painful tenderness. It was almost reverent. She must have felt his eyes. She looked up, her hand freezing on the grinder. She caught his look. She saw the unguarded gentleness in his face. She saw him seeing her, not as a burden, not as a victim, but as a person. Her breath hitched. A flush rose on her pale cheeks. She immediately dropped her gaze, staring hard at the coffee beans as if they held the secrets of the world. She was not used to being seen. She was used to being used, or being invisible. This quiet, respectful attention was more unnerving than a threat. That night, the nightmare came. Elias was pulled from a light sleep by a sound. It was not the wind. It was a low, guttural moan, a sound of absolute terror. He sat up on his bedroll. "No, no, please, God, no!" He was on his feet in an instant. Clara was thrashing on the cot, fighting the heavy pelts, her hands pushing at an invisible weight. She was trapped in a memory, and it was killing her. "Clara!" he said, moving to her side. He put his hand on her shoulder. She screamed. It was not a loud scream, but a choked, horrible sound. She bolted upright, striking out at him, her eyes wide and blind. "Get away!" "Clara!" he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the panic. "You're here! You're safe! Wake up!" Her name, spoken so firmly, pierced the fog. She stopped fighting, her chest heaving. She looked around the dark cabin, at the glowing orange eye of the hearth, at his large, shadowed form beside her. She collapsed, not back into sleep, but into a different kind of darkness. She scrambled off the cot, dragging a thin blanket with her, and, huddled by the hearth, she pressed her back against the warm stones, pulled her knees to her chest, and buried her face. She was not crying. She was shaking, a deep, bone-rattling tremor that she could not control. Elias stood for a long moment, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. He saw the true depth of the wound he had pulled from the snow. He knew this kind of shaking. It was not from the cold. He turned, grabbed the heavy wool blanket from his own bedroll, and walked back to her. She flinched as he approached, pressing herself harder against the stones. He didn't speak. He unfolded the blanket and wrapped it around her, his movements slow. He tucked it around her shoulders, his arms encircling her briefly. As he pulled the blanket snug, the back of his hand brushed her fingers, which were clutching her knees. His skin was rough, calloused, scarred from work and weather. Hers was thin, cold, and trembling. The brief touch was electric, a shock of life. It was the first time they had touched for any reason other than nursing or rescue. She stiffened, but she did not pull away. He finished tucking the blanket and retreated to his side of the room. He sat on his bedroll, his back against the cabin wall, and watched her. He would not sleep. Outside, the mountains howled. The wind tore at the roof. A great lonely beast trying to get in. It screamed down the chimney, sending sparks flying from the hearth. Inside, there was only the sound of the fire and two people breathing in the dark. Clara's shaking slowly subsided, her head still bowed. Elias sat guard, his rifle resting not far from his hand. The peace between them was fragile, built of silence and shared trauma, but it held in the smallest, warmest room in the Montana wilderness. It held. The morning after the nightmare, the cabin was thick with a new, brittle silence. Elias rose before dawn, as he always did, and built the fire from the embers. He moved with his usual quiet economy, slicing salt pork into the skillet, making coffee. He did not look at her, not directly. He did not ask if she had slept. He gave her the dignity of the morning, a space to regather herself. Clara sat on the cot, the wool blanket still clutched around her shoulders. She felt the shame hot in her belly. He had seen her break. He had seen the raw, ugly terror that lived inside her. And he had not fled. He had not struck her. He had not laughed. He had simply covered her and sat watch. She forced herself to stand, to fold the blankets, to pour water into the basin and splash her face. The cold was a welcome slap. She had to speak. She had to give him something, an explanation, a reason. It was a man. She said. Her voice was small, dry. It was swallowed by the hiss of the skillet. Elias did not turn. He merely stilled, his hand holding the wooden spatula. He waited. "Back east, in Ohio," she said, her voice gaining a thread of strength. He had a way about him. At first. Elias turned then. He looked at her. His face was unreadable, weathered, his eyes in shadow. He just listened. "He said I owed him," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "My uncle, after my father passed, my uncle said I had to earn my keep. He gave me to Mr. Brogan." She did not need to say more. The air was sick with the implication. "The hunger, that was later," she said, shaking her head, as if to clear it. "When I ran, I hid in a boxcar for 6 days. I thought I would die. I wanted to die." She met his gaze. "When I fell at your fence, I was not sure I wanted to be found." Elias absorbed this. He looked at her thin wrists, at the hollows beneath her eyes. He turned back to the fire, portioned the salt pork onto 2 tin plates, and handed one to her. "A body will fight to live," he said, his voice flat. "Even when the mind is ready to quit, eat." It was not absolution. It was not pity. It was a fact. It was the truest thing anyone had said to her in a year. She took the plate and ate. He shared nothing of himself. He was a stone wall. He was safety. He was warmth. He was food. But he was not known. He kept his own counsel. His past was a locked room, and he held the only key. Until the day she found the box. It was almost 2 weeks since her arrival, a mild day. The sun bright, melting the snow from the eaves. Elias had taken his rifle and gone into the high timber, checking his perimeter, looking for sign of elk. The cabin was hers. She was cleaning, a deep, restless cleaning. It was the only way she knew to repay the debt of her life. She was scrubbing the floorboards near his cot when her hand brushed a small, wooden box tucked far beneath the frame, hidden by shadows. It was not a lockbox. It was a simple pine box, dark with age. She pulled it out. It was light. She sat back on her heels, her heart pounding. This was his private space. She should not. She ran her thumb over the lid. It was worn smooth. She opened it. The inside was lined with faded blue velvet. There was a braid of fine, pale hair, tied with a black ribbon. There was a child's drawing, charcoal on rough paper, of a tall, stick-figure man holding hands with a smaller stick-figure girl. Above them, a lopsided sun, and beneath that, a small, worn leather Bible. Her hands trembled. She lifted it. It was heavy for its size. She opened the cover. Inside, in elegant, faded brown ink, was a name. Sarah Thorne. Born June 10th, 1861. Died November 4th, 1865. Beneath it, in the same hand, Our Light. Clara traced the name. Sarah. A child. 4 years old. She felt a cold wave of grief, a loss so profound it stole her breath. This was his locked room. This was the key. The door opened. Elias stood there, his rifle in his hand, his shoulders blocking the bright sun. The cabin was thrown into shadow. He looked at her on the floor. He looked at the open box and the Bible in her hands. His face did not change. He did not move, but the life in the room vanished. The air became thin, cold, and dead. A terrible, crushing silence descended, heavier than any blizzard. He was not the man who had fed her broth. He was a stranger, a creature of ice and rock. Clara flinched, expecting a roar of rage. I was cleaning. I did not mean—" He walked past her, his boots heavy on the wood floor. He did not look at her. He reached down and took the Bible from her hands. His touch was cold. He placed it back in the box, laid the drawing and the braid of hair on top, and shut the lid. The small click was the loudest sound she had ever heard. He stood, the box in one hand. He placed it on the highest shelf, above the hearth, tucked back in the shadows. He turned, picked up his rifle, and checked the action. He did not say a word. Clara scrambled to her feet, her hands pressed to her mouth. "Elias," he turned, his eyes flat. "The wood," he said, his voice a rasp. "Needs splitting." He went back outside. The door closed, leaving her alone with the ghost of a girl named Sarah, and a silence that was colder than the snow. That night, the weather turned. The bright sun had been a lie. A new storm, a true monster, rolled down from the north. It came not as snow, but as wind, a high, thin scream that started in the afternoon and grew into a deafening, physical roar by nightfall. By morning, the world was gone. There was no clearing, no trees, no mountains. There was only white, a horizontal, churning river of ice and air that erased the world. The snow did not fall. It flew sideways, piling in massive, sculpted drifts against the cabin, burying the single window, plunging the room into a gray, permanent twilight. Elias checked the door, shoving his shoulder against it to get it open, only to be met with a solid wall of white. "We are in," he said, barring the door. "It will blow for days." For 4 days, they were trapped. The cabin, once a shelter, became a ship in a white ocean. The wind hammered the walls, a constant, manic drumming. The roof groaned. Snow sifted in through invisible cracks, tiny, powdery ghosts in the air. They were forced into a proximity that was almost unbearable. The small room shrank with every hour. They could not be more than 10 feet apart. They fell into a routine born of pure necessity. They conserved wood, keeping the fire hot but not roaring. They conserved food, eating twice a day. The rest of the time, they worked. There was nothing else to do. Elias pulled a gunny sack from the corner. It was filled with broken pieces of harness, worn boots, and strips of raw leather. "Work for you," he said. He did not command. He stated. He brought the boot mending to the hearth, where the light was best. He sat on the floor, she on the small stool. He showed her how to heat the awl, how to wax the sinew, how to punch the holes and pull the thread tight in a lock stitch. "Not like sewing cloth," he said. His voice was quiet, close. "You pull against the stitch, lock it, so the water cannot get in." His large, scarred hands guided hers. She was clumsy at first, the leather tough, the needle thick. Her fingers, still tender from the frost, ached, but he was patient. He would hold the boot steady while she pulled the awl. "Now, hard." She pushed, and the tool slid through. "Good." His hand brushed hers as he passed her the waxed sinew. Her skin jumped, but she did not pull away. They worked for hours. The only sound was the scrape of the awl, the tug of the thread, and the howl of the world ending outside. She, in turn, worked on his clothes. His coat was a thing of patches, the wool worn thin. She took it, her small sewing kit, the only thing she had managed to save, and began to repair it. She was mending the man who had saved her. Her stitches were tiny, invisible, weaving the torn fabric back together. He watched her sometimes, in the firelight. He watched her head bent, the light catching the soft brown of her hair. Her brow furrowed in concentration. Their hands brushed often, reaching for the scissors, passing a piece of jerky, ladling stew into the same bowls. Each touch was a small fire, a reminder that they were two living, warm bodies in a world that was trying to freeze them out. The tension in the cabin was no longer just fear. It was something else, something thick and unvoiced, growing in the small space between them. On the fourth night, the storm reached its peak. The wind shrieked like a woman in mourning. Elias had just come in from a brief, brutal trip to check on his mule in the lean-to. He was covered in snow, his beard caked with ice. He slammed the bar back on the door, the wood groaning in protest. "He is fine," he said, answering her unasked question. "But the world is frozen hard." He shook the snow from his coat, his back to her. He pulled off his wet gloves and shirt, his upper body bare in the firelight. He was lean, but corded with muscle, his skin weathered. He turned to the fire, grabbing a dry blanket to rub his chest and arms. Clara had been mending her own wet socks. She sat on the hearth, her feet bare, her legs tucked under her. She, too, was damp, the chill of the cabin seeping into her bones. She had his old shirt on and a wool shawl wrapped tight. As he turned, rubbing his hair, she looked up. He was watching her. The firelight was the only light, and it was kind. It softened the harsh lines of his face, and it warmed her skin. As he watched, her shawl slipped. It fell from one shoulder, pooling in her lap. She didn't move. She did not cover herself. His old shirt gapped, revealing the line of her collarbone, the pale skin of her shoulder, and something else, a thin, white scar, old and ugly, that snaked from her shoulder down toward her breast. It was a welt, raised and puckered, the mark of a whip or a belt. She didn't move. She let him look. She was tired of hiding, tired of being ashamed of what had been done to her. She met his gaze, her own steady, defiant, and terrified. His gaze lingered. It was gentle. It was not possessive. He was not looking at her skin like Mr. Brogan had. He was not calculating her worth. He was reading her story, the one she had not told him, the one written on her body. His eyes were filled with a profound, aching sorrow. He stopped rubbing his hair. He lowered the blanket. "You," he said, his voice a low rasp, thick with an emotion she could not place. "You remind me. You have a strength I knew once." He looked into the fire. "I had a wife, Mary, and our girl, Sarah." Clara's breath caught. "They were taken," he said, his voice flat, dead. 8 years gone, fever. Took them both in 3 days. I held them. I watched the light go out, and I could not save them. I could not stop it." He looked back at her, his eyes hollowed by the memory. I have not saved anyone, not in a long time." The silence stretched, filled only by the wind and the fire. Clara felt her own pain receding, eclipsed by the chasm of his. He, too, was a survivor. He, too, was marked. She unfolded her legs. She moved toward him, just a single step. She was small beside him, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder. She looked at his hand, the one hanging by his side, calloused and scarred from the axe. Slowly, she lifted her own. She laid her small, chapped hand over his. His skin was rough, warm from the fire. He flinched, his muscles tensing, but he did not pull away. "You saved me," she whispered. He went utterly still. He looked down at her hand on his, then up at her face. He looked at her as if she had just spoken in a language he had long forgotten. He looked at her like it was the first time anyone had spoken such a thing to him, as if her words had struck the very center of his frozen grief. He raised his other hand, slowly, as if afraid she would bolt. He did not touch her scar. He laid his palm against her cheek. His skin was rough, but his touch was impossibly gentle. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. A single tear escaped, hot, immediate. He studied her face, his thumb brushing the tear from her cheek. The distance between them was gone. There was only the firelight, and the storm, and this terrible, fragile need. He bent his head. He kissed her. It was slow. It was cautious. It was the hesitant touch of two people who had forgotten what kindness felt like. His lips were chapped, firm, tasting of coffee in the cold night air. Hers were soft, salty with her tear. It was a kiss of questions, not answers. Then the restraint broke. A restrained hunger, deep and starved, rose in both of them. It was not lust, but a desperate need for life, for warmth, for contact, a need to prove they were not ghosts. She gripped his arm, her fingers digging in, and he deepened the kiss, his hand moving from her cheek to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. It was raw and real, and it was everything they had both been denied. He was the one who pulled away. He broke the kiss suddenly, resting his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. His eyes were closed. He looked pained. "Clara," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You don't owe me anything." He thought this was payment, like Mr. Brogan. The shame and anger rose in her, thick and hot. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Her voice broke, a raw, aching sound. "I know." She gripped the front of his trousers, her knuckles white. "I know I do not owe you, but I want to feel human again." His eyes opened, wide. He looked at her, truly seeing the depth of her desire. Not for him, not for sex, but for humanity. He had no words. He could not speak past the lump in his throat. He simply nodded, once, a short, tight gesture. He took her hand from his arm, held it for a beat, and then released it. He stepped back. He picked up his bedroll from the corner. She returned to the cot. They slept apart that night. He on the floor by the door, she on the cot by the hearth. The storm raged, but it was no longer the loudest thing in the cabin. The silence was. It was full of unsaid desire, of memories and confessions, of a kiss that hung in the air, a fragile, dangerous thing that had changed the space between them forever. The first sound of the spring melt was water. It was not the rush of a river, but the slow, patient drip, drip, drip from the cabin eaves, a sound that had been absent for 5 long months. It was the sound of the world unclogging its throat. The snow, which had been a heavy, suffocating blanket, grew rotten and soft, pulling back from the cabin walls, revealing the damp, dark earth beneath. The air, once sharp and sterile, now carried a new smell, wet stone, thawed pine, and the promise of mud. Clara felt the change in her bones. The deep, animal hibernation of survival was ending. The sun had warmth in it again, a heat that penetrated her wool shirt and touched her skin. With the melt came work, a new, relentless list of chores. Elias opened the heavy door to the root cellar, a dark, slanted hole in the ground near the woodpile, and the smell of damp earth and old potatoes rolled out. "It will have flooded," he said, and it had. A foot of icy water stood at the bottom. For 2 days, they hauled it out, bucket by bucket. Clara worked alongside him, her body thin but hardened by the winter. Her hands, once raw, were now calloused. She did not tire easily. She scrubbed the shelves while he repaired the seals. She helped him prepare his traps, boiling them in a large kettle with sumac leaves to remove the human scent. She watched his large, careful hands resetting the springs, his movements economical and precise. He was a man who wasted nothing, not a motion, not a word, not a piece of sinew. He turned over a patch of ground near the cabin, the earth rocky and stubborn. He was making a garden. He gave her a small tin of seeds. "These are Mary's," he said, his voice flat, offering no other explanation. "They are likely no good, but the ground is here." Clara took the tin. Inside were beans, dried and wrinkled, and tiny, dark specks that might have been herbs. She planted them with a fierce, protective care, building small walls of stone to guard the rows. She found herself, one afternoon, humming a tune she did not know she remembered. She was kneeling in the mud, her hands black with it, and the sun was warm on her back. She looked up, and Elias was standing by the woodpile. watching her. He had been there for some time. His face held the same quiet, aching tenderness she had seen before, an expression of quiet awe. She smiled. It was not a large smile. It was a small, fragile thing, rusty from disuse. But it was real. Elias's expression shuddered. He looked away, as if he'd seen something too bright, something that pained him. He turned his back to her and began to split wood with a sudden, violent energy, the axe striking the logs with a force that seemed almost angry. Clara's smile faded. The warmth in her chest turned cold. The kiss, it lived between them, a heavy, unexploded thing. Since that night in the storm, he had not touched her. He had, in fact, moved further away. He still slept on the floor, but he was careful to keep a greater distance. He spoke to her only of the chores. He handed her tools, mugs, plates, his fingers careful to never, ever brush hers. He was a wall of quiet, polite distance. He was saving her, feeding her, sheltering her, but he would not let her in. She noticed. The way he would go still when she moved too close in the small cabin. The way his eyes would follow her, but he would never meet her gaze. The way his voice was always gentle, but never warm. She had offered herself, and he had kissed her with a desperate hunger. And then he had retreated. She understood. She was damaged. She was used. She was the woman who had collapsed at his fence, a piece of human wreckage. He had saved her, as he would save a wounded animal. But he did not want her. He had pulled her from the snow, but he would not let her into his life. The shame she had held at bay for weeks returned, bitter and sharp. One evening, the work was done. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in bruises of purple and red. The air was mild. They sat on the small porch he had built, 2 chairs, side by side, but not touching. They watched the color bleed from the world. The silence stretched, filled only with the sound of the creek, now swollen with melt. Clara could not bear the silence any longer. She could not bear his respectful, painful distance. She had to know if she was a guest or a prisoner, or just a burden he was too kind to cast off. She turned to him. He was staring at the horizon, his profile carved from the twilight, hard and lonely. "You think I am ruined," she said. Her voice was flat. It was not a question. He turned his head slowly. His eyes met hers in the dusk. He did not deny it. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, his face a mask of stone. "You are right to," she said, her voice shaking. But she pushed on. "You do not know the half of it. You do not know what I am." "Clara," he began, his voice a low warning. "No," she said. "You saved my life. You have a right to know what kind of life it was." She took a breath, drawing in the cold evening air, and she told him the truth. Not the fragments, not the hints. She told him all of it, her voice low and steady, her eyes fixed on the dark line of the trees. "My father was a good man, a teacher. He died of consumption. We had nothing. My uncle, my father's brother, he took me in. He had a boarding house in Cincinnati. He said I would work. I did, for 2 years. I scrubbed his floors, washed his linens. I was 14. She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. "When I turned 16, a man came to the house, Mr. Brogan, the one I told you of. He was wealthy. He dealt in shipping. My uncle owed him money, a great deal of money. I heard them arguing." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "My uncle, he told Mr. Brogan he had one thing of value. He took me to Brogan's room. He sold me, like a sack of grain, to pay his debt." Elias made a sound, a low, guttural noise, like an animal hit with a stone, but he did not speak. "Brogan kept me in his house for a year," Clara said, her voice dead. All emotion burned out of it. He used me. He let his friends use me. He said I was his property. He said if I ran, he would find me and slit my throat. I believed him, and when he was tired of me, when I was used up, He gave me to one of his riverboat captains as a gift. She was shaking now. The memory, a physical thing. A cold sickness in her belly. That was the man I ran from. The captain, he was worse. He liked pain. One night in St. Louis, he got drunk. He passed out. I took his wallet, $32. And I ran. I just ran. I ran until I hit the rail yard. I saw an open boxcar on a train heading west. I climbed in. I did not care where it was going. She closed her eyes. I hid behind crates of machinery. I had no food, no water. The train moved for days. It was so cold. I thought I would die. When it finally stopped, somewhere in the territory, they opened the car. They found me. They threw me out. They called me a tramp, a whore. I walked for 2 days. And then the blizzard started. I stole bread from a trapper's camp. He saw me. He chased me. I ran until I did not know where I was. And then I fell, at your fence. She finished. The story was told. It hung in the air between them, ugly and poisoned. She looked at him. She was expecting disgust, pity, revulsion. Elias was silent for a long time, a full minute. He stared out at the mountains, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, his knuckles white in the gloom. He seemed to have stopped breathing. The only movement was the rigid line of his jaw, working, clenching and unclenching. When he finally spoke, his voice was a stranger's. It was rough, thick, and vibrating with an anger so cold it was terrifying. He did not look at her. He looked at the darkness. You deserved better, he said. He took a ragged breath. He turned his head, and his eyes found hers in the dark. They were not filled with pity. They were burning. You still do? That night, the cabin was a cage. He had validated her. He had seen the entirety of her ruin, and he had not named her ruined. He had named her wronged. Elias lay on his bedroll, his back to her. She lay on the cot, her body trembling. The air was thick with his unspent rage, and her unspent grief. She could not lie there, alone. One more second. She rose from the cot. The floorboards were cold beneath her bare feet. She made no sound, but he knew. She felt him go still as she crossed the small space. She did not ask. She did not speak. She knelt beside his bedroll, pulled back the edge of the heavy blanket, and slid in beside him. He was tense, his whole body rigid as stone. He was on his back, staring at the ceiling. She lay on her side, facing him, her small body close to his large one. She could feel the heat coming off him, the coiled energy. Clara, he whispered. It was a plea, a warning. I know, she whispered back. I am not paying a debt. I am not that girl anymore. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it on his chest. He flinched, but he did not move away. She felt the heavy, pounding beat of his heart beneath her palm. It was racing. I want to feel human, she said again, the words that had hung between them since the storm. Not owned, not used, just human. He turned his head, and his eyes met hers in the near dark. He saw her face, the desperation, the fear, and the pure, unadulterated need. He made his choice. He turned onto his side, facing her. He slid one arm beneath her, pulling her close, his other hand coming up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. Their lovemaking was not the gentle, hesitant kiss of the storm. It was gentle at first. It was a relearning. His hands were calloused but careful, mapping her body with a reverence that made her want to weep. His kisses were slow, deep, a promise, not a demand. He touched her scar, not with disgust, but with a sad, gentle tracing, as if trying to heal it with his fingers. He gave her time. He gave her space. He let her set the pace. But beneath the gentleness was a desperation that matched her own. His loneliness, 8 years deep, and her agony, a lifetime long, finally broke free. The gentleness gave way. It became raw, urgent, a frantic collision. It was not pretty. It was elemental. It was two people, starved of touch, starved of life. clinging to each other in the dark, trying to burn away the past in a fire of their own making. It was a drowning man pulling a drowning woman to shore, and neither knowing who was saving whom. Afterward, as the world slowly reformed around them, as the sounds of the cabin, the settling logs, the distant wind returned, she broke. She lay in his arms, her head on his chest, and she cried. It was not the choked, terrified screams of her nightmares. It was a deep, silent, shuddering grief. The sobs tore through her body, a lifetime of pain, humiliation, and terror finally being released. She cried for the girl she had been, for the father she had lost, for the life that had been stolen from her. She cried for the hunger and the cold and the men who had treated her like an object. Elias did not speak. He did not ask her why. He did not shush her or try to comfort her with words. He simply held her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tighter, making his body a fortress around hers. He held her as if he could absorb the pain, as if his own strength could mend her broken pieces. He just held her tighter, his hand stroking her hair, his chin resting on top of her head, and let her weep until there were no tears left. In the gray light of morning, he woke. He was alone in the bedroll. For a disoriented second, he thought he had dreamed it. The cabin was cold. Then he saw her. She was not on the cot. She was sitting at the table, dressed in his old shirt, her back to him. The fire was already built, the kettle on. She was sewing. He rose, quiet, and came up behind her. She was mending the shirt he had worn yesterday, the one with the torn cuff. Her stitches were small, neat, perfect. She was pulling the fabric of his life back together. He stood watching her, his heart a heavy, aching thing in his chest. She did not turn, but she knew he was there. "You never said," she said, her voice quiet, a little rough from the night. "You told me about the fever, but you never said what you lost." He pulled out the other chair and sat down, his back to the fire, so he could see her face. She looked tired, her eyes puffy, but she was calm. The terror was gone. He looked down at his hands. He opened them, then closed them. "I lost everything," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I lost the sun, Mary. She was light. She laughed all the time. She could make anything grow. She saw no bad in anyone, not even me." He swallowed, the memory thick in his throat. "And Sarah, she was 4. She was all of her mother, but she had my quiet. She would sit with me for hours while I carved. She would just watch." He looked up, his eyes unfocused, seeing a different room, a different life. "When the fever came, it was fast. Mary went first. She was hot, then she was cold. She just slipped away. I was holding her hand. Sarah, she lasted 2 more days. She kept asking for her mother. I kept telling her she was sleeping. On the last morning, she stopped asking. I buried them, side by side, on the hill behind our homestead, back in Illinois." He looked at Clara, his eyes full of the 8 years of cold. "I sold the farm. I gave the money away. I did not care. I walked. I kept walking west until I could not walk anymore. I came up here, this mountain. It was quiet. It did not ask questions. It did not expect anything. I never left. I never planned to." He had not told another living soul. He had not spoken their names aloud in almost 8 years. Clara put down the shirt. She reached across the table and laid her small, calloused hand over his. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. They sat in silence as the sun rose. 2 survivors, their stories finally told, their hands locked together over the rough-spun wood of the table. The shadows did not vanish. The past was not a ghost that could be banished by a single night of honesty. But the cabin was no longer a place of silence. It was filled with new sounds, the sharp, deafening crack of the rifle. Elias took her to the clearing, stood behind her, his body pressed against her back, his arms around hers, showing her how to hold the heavy weapon. "You brace it," he said, his voice in her ear. "Brace it against your shoulder, hard, or it will break you. Do not be afraid of it. You are its master. Squeeze. Do not pull. She fired. The recoil slammed into her, and she stumbled back into his chest. He held her steady. She had missed the pine cone he had pointed at by a foot. Again, he said. She learned. She learned to shoot, to clean the rifle, to handle the revolver he kept. She learned to be the master. Her garden grew. The beans sprouted, tentative green shoots pushing through the dark earth. She found wild herbs, thyme and mint, and something he called yarrow. She gathered wild berries from the lower slopes, and in the heat of the early summer, the cabin was filled with the sweet, thick smell of bubbling fruit. She made jam, sealing it in the jars Mary had left behind. They began to act like a couple. They moved around each other with a new, easy grace. He would come in from checking the perimeter and she would have stew hot for him. She would be mended his clothes, and he would be carving a new, stronger handle for her garden spade. He slept in the cot now. She slept with him. Some nights, they clung to each other, their bodies finding a desperate solace. Other nights, they just slept, his arm heavy and secure around her waist, her back pressed against his chest. It was a warmth she had never known. But the shadows remained. He would still watch her, and she would see a fear in his eyes, a fear of losing her, a fear that he had found something he could not protect. And she still started at loud noises. When a branch cracked in the woods, her head would snap up, her eyes wide, her hand reaching for the knife she now kept at her belt. The world was still out there. The men who had hurt her were still out there. They had found peace, but they both knew, in the quiet, unspoken places, that it was a fragile peace, and they knew it would not last. The high summer was a time of warmth and work. The patch of earth Elias had tilled, the one Clara had planted with Mary's old seeds, had proven fertile, green. Living things pushed up through the dark soil, a defiant answer to the months of white. Clara tended it with a fierce devotion, her hands now stained with earth instead of blood. She was stronger. The hollows in her cheeks had filled, and her body, though still slender, moved with the easy, powerful grace of someone who works from sunup to sundown. They had fallen into a life. It was a life built of shared labor and quiet nights. He would hunt, and she would dress the game. She would mend, and he would carve. He had even begun building a small, sturdy table for her garden work, whistling a low, tuneless song as he worked, a sound that made her stop and listen, her heart aching with a fragile, unfamiliar happiness. They were, in these quiet moments, almost a husband and a wife. The shadows of their pasts were still there, long and dark in the evenings, but the sun of the present was bright. The peace was broken by the sound of a voice that was not his. Elias was splitting the last of the winter-cured wood, his movements a familiar, steady rhythm. Clara was washing tin plates by the open door, enjoying the warm breeze. A man emerged from the tree line, leading a mule piled high with pelts. He was wiry, bearded to his eyes, and smelled of grease and pine. Clara vanished. It was an instinct, a flicker of motion. One moment she was at the basin, the next she was in the cabin's deepest shadow, her hand on the knife at her belt. Elias did not stop his swing. The axe bit deep, splitting the round. He looked up, his face impassive. "Jed," he said. "Elias," the man replied, his voice a dry crackle. He stopped a respectful distance from the cabin. "Saw your smoke. Figured you hadn't been eaten yet." "Not yet. Coffee's on." "Don't mind if I do." The man, Jedediah Miller, was one of the few trappers who worked this high, and he passed Elias's claim perhaps once a year. He was a man of the mountains, and he understood boundaries. He unshouldered his pack and sat on the porch step, accepting the mug Elias poured for him. Elias leaned against the porch rail, not sitting, his body relaxed but ready. Jed sipped the coffee, hot and black. "World's busy down below. Elias, fort's crawling. Always is. In summer. Not like this. There's money moving. Gold rumors from the north. But something else. 2. He took another long swallow. Strangest thing, I was at the trading post. Saw a poster, brand new, crisp, offering $500. $500, cash. Elias said nothing. For a girl, Jed said. He stared into his mug. A runaway, from St. Louis, or maybe Ohio. Some rich man's. Well, the poster was polite. Called her an indentured ward. Brown hair, pale, thin. Answers to the name of Clara. Inside the cabin, the world stopped. Clara's hand, the one not on the knife, flew to her mouth. Her breathing ceased. Jed Miller was an observant man. He had seen the flick of movement as he approached. He had seen the 2 chairs on the porch. He had seen the small, weeded garden patch. He had seen the way Elias, who never offered anything, had coffee ready. He lifted his eyes, slowly, and looked past Elias into the shadows of the open door. He saw her. He saw a pale face, wide with terror, and dark, haunted eyes. His gaze held hers for a long, silent beat. He looked from her to Elias. Elias had not moved. He was granite. His eyes were flat, cold as the winter creek. The message was clear. Jed Miller broke the stare. He looked back down at his coffee. He drained the mug in one gulp and stood, brushing crumbs from his beard. Well, he said, handing the mug back, $500. Brings the wolves out. I saw 2 men at the post, asking about trails. Hard men, not trappers. One was a little weasel of a man. The other looked like he'd scalp his own mother for $1. Names of Finch and Carver. He shouldered his pack, his eyes on the tree line. A man would have to be a fool to come up this high for anything. The ground's hard, and the folks are harder. He glanced at Elias. You take care. Thorn. Some things ain't worth $500, and some are worth a whole lot more. He nodded, once, and disappeared back into the pine, as silent as he had come. For a full minute, neither of them moved. The cabin was silent, save for the buzz of a fly and the sudden, frantic pounding of Clara's heart. The peace was not just broken, it was slaughtered. That night, she was a ghost. She was the woman he had found at the fence line. She did not eat. She did not speak. She sat on the cot, her knees drawn to her chest, and stared at the wall. Every sound, the pop of the fire, the hoot of an owl, the creak of the cabin settling, made her jump, her body rigid with terror. Elias watched her. He sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. The click-clack of the metal parts the only sound. He did not press her. He did not offer comfort. He just prepared. His movements were methodical, calm, and lethal. Clara watched his hands, his scarred, strong hands, rubbing oil into the barrel, checking the spring, seating the ammunition. He was preparing to kill. For her, the realization was a stone in her gut. She had brought this. She had brought the wolves to his door. He had saved her, and she was going to be the death of him, the man from her past. Brogan, or the captain, it did not matter. He was a spider, and his web reached all the way out here, to this one safe place, and he would pull it all down just to have her back. She could not let that happen. She waited. She waited until the moon was high, until the cabin was filled with the deep, steady sound of his breathing. He was asleep on the cot, she on her bedroll on the floor, a change he had insisted on since Jed's visit. So he was closer to the door, her hands shaking so violently she could barely function. She rose. She moved like smoke. She gathered her few things, the mended dress, the knife he had given her, a small pouch of the jam she had made, a heel of bread. She was a runaway again. She slipped out of the cabin. The night air was cool. The moon was a bright, cold eye. She went to the lean-to. The mule huffed, soft, in the darkness. Shh, she whispered, her hand on its flank. She fumbled with the saddle, her fingers stiff and stupid with panic. She could not get the cinch tight. She was crying, silent, hot tears of shame and fear. She had to leave. She would go north, into the high wilderness, where they would never find her. She would die there, probably, but she would die free, and he would live. A hand closed over hers in the darkness. large, warm, and firm, stopping her movements. She choked, a sound of pure terror, and spun, the knife in her hand. Elias stood there. He was not angry. He was not even surprised. He looked at her, his face carved in moonlight and shadow, and his eyes were filled with a profound, breaking sadness. "What are you doing, Clara?" he asked, his voice low, as if not to wake the mountains. "I am leaving," she gasped, the tears choking her. "I have to. You heard him. $500. They are killers. They will come, and they will kill you. For me. I won't. I will not bring this trouble on you. I will not be the reason you die. Please, Elias, let me go. It is the only way. Please." She was pleading, her hands clutching the front of his shirt, her face wet. He did not move. He simply looked down at her, at this small, terrified, brave woman who was willing to walk back into the wilderness to save him. He slowly, gently, uncurled her fingers from the knife hilt. He took the blade from her hand. Then he took the saddle straps from her other hand. "Trouble," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You think you are trouble." He took her shoulders, his grip not hard, but unbreakable. He made her look at him. "Before you came, Clara, I was not alive. I was waiting. I chopped wood. I set traps. I breathed, but I was not living. I was a ghost in my own house. I was waiting to die." "This place," he motioned to the cabin. "The trees. It was not a home. It was a grave, a place to hide from the memories." He lifted one hand and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "You fell at my fence, and I woke up. You," he said, his voice thick. "You are not trouble. You're my home now." She stared at him, her breath catching. "I ran once," he said, his eyes hard. "I ran from Illinois. I ran from my life. I am done running. We are done running. They want to come here? Let them come. This is our home. We will not be moved." She collapsed against him, her fight gone, replaced by a terrible, shuddering fear. "They will kill you." "No," he said, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight against his chest. "They will not." He led her back inside, his arm around her. The saddle lay, forgotten, on the dirt floor of the lean-to. The next morning, the cabin was a fortress. The grim resolve had settled. "They will come," Elias said, sipping his coffee. "Jed saw them. They'll be asking questions. They'll find this place." He looked at her. "Clara is gone. The girl they are looking for, she is not here." Clara understood. She went to the wash basin, staring at her reflection. She saw the pale, frightened girl from Cincinnati. She saw the runaway. She picked up Elias's skinning knife. Her hand was steady now. She gathered her long brown hair, the hair that had grown all winter, in one hand, and she cut it. She sawed at the thick locks, the blade blunt for this work, but she did not stop. She hacked it off, short, ragged, just below her ears. It fell in soft, dead piles on the floor. It was a shearing. It was a sacrifice. She looked at her reflection again. A different person looked back. A stranger, with wide, haunted eyes and shorn hair. Elias watched her. He nodded. "Once." "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quiet. She took a breath. My name is Annie." "Who?" he pressed, his voice harder. "Annie," she said, her voice stronger. She met his gaze in the reflection. "I'm Annie Thorne. I've always been here." "Good," he said. He went back to the table. He laid out his weapons, the rifle, the revolver, 2 long knives. "Here is the plan. You are my wife's kin. Annie, you came from back east to help. Your mind is not always right. You are shy of strangers. You stay inside." He looked at her, his eyes pinning her. "No matter what you hear, you stay inside. If I call your name, Annie, you do not come. You go to the root cellar. You take the revolver. You bar the door from the inside, and you do not come out. Not for any reason, not even for me, unless you hear me call Clara. Do you understand? I understand. Only Clara brings you out. Then they waited. A day passed, then 2. The tension was a living thing in the cabin. A third person at the table. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a blue jay was a harbinger. They worked, but their movements were jerky, their senses strained. They did not sleep. They rested. Elias by the door, Clara on the cot, the revolver under her pillow. On the 3rd day, they came. Elias was outside, standing by the woodpile. He was not chopping. He was just waiting. He had been there for an hour, his rifle leaning against the logs, his hand resting on the axe. Clara saw them first, from the window. 2 riders, emerging from the trees, just as Jed had described. One small and hunched, a weasel. The other large, broad-shouldered, wearing a long duster despite the heat. They rode with an arrogance, their horses picking their way into the clearing. Inside, Elias said, not turning. Clara backed away from the window, her heart a cold stone. She went to the darkest corner of the cabin, near the hearth, the revolver heavy in her hand. She watched through a crack in the doorframe. The men stopped, their horses blowing. "Afternoon," the big one said. His voice was oily, like rancid butter. "This is private land," Elias said. His voice was flat. "Well now." The little one, Finch, piped up. "We ain't here for your land, old man. We're looking for something. Property." "Seen nothing." Elias said, "That's so?" The big one, Carver, said. He dismounted, slow, his duster pulling back to show the matched pistols at his hips. He looked around. His eyes missed nothing. "You live here all alone?" "My wife's kin is with me," Elias said. "Wife's kin." Carver mused. He walked closer. "She pretty? Brown hair? Thin?" "She's sickly," Elias said, his voice turning cold. "And she don't take to strangers." Finch sniffed the air. A predatory, animal movement. "I smell something sweet, like berries." He smiled. A broken-toothed, ugly thing. "You a man for putting up preserves? Mountain man?" The lie was dead. Carver's eyes narrowed. I think we'd like to meet her, pay our respects." "No," Elias said. It was a standoff. The air vibrated. Carver's hand was at his belt. Finch was shifting, his eyes darting to the cabin door, then back to Elias. Elias could not fight them both. Not here, not with her 10 feet away. He had to move them. He sighed, a long, suffering sound. "Look," he said, his voice changing, becoming weary. "You're looking for that girl, the one on the poster." Carver's eyes lit. "You seen her?" "I think so," Elias said, lying smoothly. 4, maybe 5 days ago. South Ridge. Saw a sign of a small camp. Looked like someone traveling light and hard. Headed for the pass. I thought it was just a half-starved trapper. But brown hair. Yes, I remember." Finch looked at Carver, excited. "The pass. We can catch her." Carver was still suspicious. He looked at Elias, then at the cabin. "Why didn't you say so?" "Not my business," Elias said, shrugging. "Figured she was running from someone. Now I know who and why." He glanced at the $500 poster now tacked to Carver's saddlebag. "You'll show us." Carver demanded. "It's tricky ground." Elias said, "Steep. You'll miss the sign. You'll take us." Carver said, "Finch, you stay here. Make sure the sickly kin don't wander off." This was what Elias had feared. He shook his head. "No, she's not right in the head. Fever. She sees a stranger. She'll start screaming. High, terrible sound. Scares the game for miles. You want to track? We all go, quietly. Or she'll ruin it for all of us." Carver stared at him, weighing the options. The $500 won. "Fine," he snarled. "We all go, but you walk in front, 10 paces. My rifle." Elias started. "You leave it." Carver said, "You won't need it. We got ours." Elias leaned his rifle against the cabin wall. He turned his back on it. He looked once, a quick, imperceptible glance, at the door. Then he started walking toward the south ridge. Carver and Finch followed, on foot, leading their horses. The moment they were in the trees, Clara moved. She did as she was told. She grabbed the revolver. She grabbed a skinning knife. She ran to the root cellar, her shorn hair flying. She pulled the heavy, slanted door up, slipped into the cold, damp darkness, and pulled it shut over her head. Darkness, absolute. The smell of cold earth, old potatoes, and fear. She found the heavy wooden bar Elias had built inside and slotted it into place. She was buried. She huddled in the black, the revolver in her lap, her body shaking in great, silent waves. She waited. It was the longest time of her life. The sun, which she could not see, moved across the sky. The cellar, cool at first, became frigid. She did not know if it was day or night. She strained her ears. Nothing, just the muffled, dead sound of the earth around her. She prayed. She prayed to a God she had long since abandoned. She prayed to Elias. She prayed to Mary and Sarah. Hours passed. She must have dozed, a fitful, terrified sleep, because she was jerked awake by a sound. Footsteps, above her, on the ground. Heavy, one person. She raised the revolver, her hands slick with sweat, her teeth chattering. The bar on the door was solid, but the door was just wood. The footsteps stopped, right above her head. She aimed the gun at the wooden slats. Then, a scraping sound, the heavy door being dragged open. Light, gray and dim, flooded the cellar. A silhouette blocked it, huge, dark. She screamed, a dry, small sound, and raised the gun. "Clara!" It was his voice. She dropped the gun. She scrambled out, clawing at the dirt, falling into the twilight of the clearing. He caught her, his arms closing around her. She was sobbing, hysterical, clutching him. Elias! Elias! He was alive. He was standing. He held her for a long moment, his hand stroking her shorn hair, his breathing ragged. "You're safe," he whispered. "It's done." She pulled back, and in the dying light, she saw him. His face was a mask of bruises. A long, deep cut over his left eye was bleeding freely, the blood matting his hair and beard. His shirt was torn open. His knuckles were raw, split open, and caked in blood. A dark, wet stain was spreading on his side. You're hurt," she gasped, her hands flying to his face, to his side. "Oh God, Elias, you're bleeding." He looked down at his side, as if just noticing. "It's just a graze. Their horses spooked on the ridge." She looked past him, wildly, at the empty clearing. The horses were gone. The men were gone. "Where are they?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Elias, where are they?" He did not answer. He just looked at her, and his eyes were the eyes she had seen when she found the Bible. They were dead. They were empty of everything but a cold, ancient sorrow. He pushed past her, stumbling slightly, and walked into the cabin. He sat down, heavily, at the table, his bloody hands resting on the wood. We won't be seeing them again. The finality of it, the cold, flat emptiness of his voice, hit her harder than a blow. He had not just led them away. He had taken them to his ground. The tricky ground, the scree, the deadfalls, the sudden, 1,000-foot drops. He had gone, unarmed, against 2 armed men, and he was the only one who had come back. The horror of it choked her. This was the man who had fed her broth, who had taught her to plant seeds, who held her in the night. He was a killer. She slid to the floor, her back against the wall, the strength gone from her. She broke. "No!" She wept, her hands covering her face. "No, no! You killed them! For me! You killed! For me!" She was not just crying. She was begging. She looked up at him, her face a ruin of tears and dirt. "Elias, no more. Please, don't kill again. I am not worth it. I am not worth your soul." He sat in the deepening gloom, staring at his bloody hands. For a long time, the only sound was her broken sobs. Finally, he moved. He rose, every motion stiff and pained. He went to the wash basin, poured water from the bucket, and slowly, deliberately, began to wash the blood and grime from his hands. The water in the basin turned a dark, murky red. He dried his hands on a rag and turned to her. He walked over and sat on the floor in front of her, his knees almost touching hers. "Clara," he said, his voice quiet, rough with exhaustion. When Sarah died, I wasn't just sad. I was angry. I was angry at the world, at God, at the fever for being stronger than me." He looked at his hands, now clean, but still raw. "I came up here. I wasn't just hiding from the pain. I was hiding from what I was. I've been alone for 8 years. To survive. You do things. You fight things. Animals. And men. Men who come to take what you have. Men who think you are weak because you are alone." He met her gaze, his eyes clear, honest, and filled with a terrible peace. "What I did today," he said, his voice soft, "it was not for you." She stared, confused, the tears stopping. "What?" "It was for us," he said. "It was for this cabin, for that garden, for this home. They came here. They tried to take it. They tried to take my home from me. Again." He reached out and took her hands. His were rough, bruised, but his grip was gentle. "I made my peace with what I have to do to protect what is mine a long, long time ago. Long before you ever came. I am not a good man. Clara, I'm just a man, and you are mine. This home is mine. I will not let the world take anything from me. Not ever again." He was not asking for forgiveness. He was telling her the truth. He was the mountain. He was the winter. And he had protected his own. She looked at him, at the blood on his face and the fierce, unbreakable love in his eyes, and she knew she was, finally, safe. The first days after the ridge were a blur of grim necessity. The man who returned to the cabin was not the quiet, steady man she had come to know. He was a different creature entirely, his eyes holding the cold, flat emptiness of the winter sky, his movements stiff and pained. The graze he had claimed was a lie. When he stumbled, his hand flying to his side, and she saw the dark, wet stain spreading through his shirt. She moved past her fear. "Sit," she commanded, her voice a low, steady thing she didn't recognize. He obeyed, slumping into the chair at the table, his strength finally gone. She ripped the shirt open. A bullet had torn a ragged furrow through the flesh and muscle of his side, just above his hip. It was deep, seeping blood, and already beginning to swell. He had walked, fought, and killed with this wound. She went into a state of cold, clear focus. She had seen her father through his final, agonizing months. She knew the mechanics of a wounded body. She boiled water. She tore their cleanest sheet, one Mary had left in a chest, into strips. She got the needle, the one she used for mending, and the sinew. He sat, unmoving, his breathing shallow, his eyes fixed on the wall as she cleaned the wound with whiskey. He did not flinch, though his knuckles were white where he gripped the table. "This will hurt," she said. "Do it!" He rasped. She stitched his skin. Her hands, which had trembled in the root cellar, were now rock steady. She pulled the needle through, punched it back, and tied the knots, just as he had taught her to do with leather. She was mending him, her small, neat stitches pulling his flesh back together. When she was done, she wrapped his torso in the clean bandages, her touch gentle but firm. He had not spoken a word. He looked at her, his face bruised and bloody, his eyes filled with a dark, terrible knowledge. She was no longer just the woman he had saved. She was the one who had seen him, all of him, and had stitched him back together. They rebuilt, not with words. They did not speak of Finch or Carver. They did not speak of the horses that were gone, or the 2 rifles that were now theirs. They spoke of the work. He healed slowly. The wound in his side ached, and for a week he was weak, angry at his own body. Clara took over. She chopped the wood, her swings clumsy but effective. She hauled the water. She tended her garden, pulling the last of the summer beans, her hands covered in the rich dirt. She fed him, tended the fire, and sat watch at night, the revolver on her lap, while he slept the deep, fitful sleep of healing. As his strength returned, a new, restless energy filled him. The cabin, which had been his fortress, now felt small, cramped. It was full of her herbs hanging to dry, her empty jars of jam, her mending basket. One morning, in the late summer, he went out. He did not take his rifle. He took the axe. Clara watched from the window as he walked to a stand of young, straight pines. He examined them, one by one, and then, with a clean, powerful swing, he began to fell a tree. He worked all day. He did not stop. He cut, trimmed, and notched. When he came in that evening, his wound aching, she was waiting. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Building," he said, wiping the sweat from his face. "Building what?" "A room," he said, not looking at her. "For your things. A place to store the winter goods." Clara's heart seized. A new room. A permanent, solid addition. He was binding her to this place with logs and mud. "Elias, no," she said, her voice small. "You don't need to. This is fine. It is more than I ever had. I don't need—" "I need it," he said, his voice curt, cutting her off. He looked at her then, his eyes intense. "The winter is long. We need space to move. I will not be trapped in one room again." She knew he was not just talking about the weather. "But your side, the work will heal it," he said. She knew it was a lie. The work would tear his stitches. The next morning, she was outside with him. If he was going to break himself building a room for her, she would not let him do it alone. "I can help," she said. He looked at her thin arms, and a small, almost smile touched his lips. "This is not mending. Clara, show me," she said. He showed her. He showed her how to use the adze to peel the bark. He showed her how to mix the mud and straw for the chinking. A messy, heavy job. She was not strong, but she was relentless. She hauled stones for the foundation. She learned to read his grunts, his nods. They worked as a team. It took them weeks. They built a lean-to addition off the back of the cabin, a solid 10 by 10 room. He cut a door from the main room as he set the final roof beams. The first hard frost of autumn turned the mountainside a brittle, glittering white. The room was hers. He built her a small cot, shelves, and a table. She moved her things, the jars of jam, the dried herbs, the small, leather-bound journal he had brought back from a silent trip to the trading post weeks ago. It was the first space, in her entire life, that belonged only to her. Their new life was interrupted by the outside world. They heard the wagon before they saw it, the rattle of wheels and the braying of a mule echoing in the crisp fall air. Elias, who was splitting the last of the wood for the winter pile, froze. He picked up his rifle, his eyes narrowing. "It's just Sutter's," he said, his voice tight. "From the valley. Stay inside." "Elias." "Inside. Clara." She retreated, her hands suddenly cold. She watched from the window. A rough buckboard wagon pulled into the clearing. A thin, worn-looking man held the reins. Beside him, a woman sat bolt upright, her face set in a mask of rigid piety. "Josiah and Martha Sutter." "Elias," Josiah called, his voice friendly but thin. "Saw your smoke. Figured we'd see if you survived the summer." "Survived," Elias said. He did not move, his rifle held loosely in one hand. "Brought you some salt pork," Josiah said, gesturing to a parcel. "Martha put up too much." "Martha?" Elias nodded, his voice devoid of warmth. Martha Sutter's eyes were not on Elias. They were on the cabin. They missed nothing. They saw the new room, they saw the garden, and they saw Clara, a shadow in the window. "You have company," Martha said, her voice thin and sharp. Elias said nothing. "We heard rumors at the post," Martha continued, her eyes like two small, hard birds. "About Trouble. Bounty men. Trouble's past. Elias said, So it seems. Martha looked at the new room. You've been busy expanding. Josiah cleared his throat. Uneasy. Now, Martha, it is not proper, Mr. Thorne, Martha said, her voice gaining strength, to keep a young woman here, alone, unmarried, so far from a church. Her eyes found Clara in the window, and they were filled with a cold, righteous judgment. Whatever her past, she has a soul. You're putting it in peril, and your own. Clara flinched, stepping back from the window, the blood draining from her face. She felt the old, familiar shame, hot and suffocating. She was a disgrace, before she could retreat further. Elias moved. He stepped forward, his boots silent on the hard-packed earth, until he was standing beside the wagon. He looked up at Martha Sutter. His face was not angry. It was cold. It was the face he had worn when he'd returned from the ridge. Martha, he said, his voice low and dangerous. This is my land. That is my home. He nodded toward the cabin. Annie is my family. She is under my protection. You will not speak to her, or of her, in that way. Not ever. Do you understand me? The judgment in Martha's face withered, replaced by a sudden, stark fear. She had heard the stories about the mountain man, Elias Thorne. Now, she believed them. I meant no offense to God, she stammered. Then you'll keep your offense to yourself. Elias said. Josiah Sutter grabbed the reins. Weather's turning. We best be going. Elias, good to see you. Good to see you well. He turned the wagon in a tight, panicked circle, and they rattled back down the trail, leaving the salt pork forgotten. Elias stood for a long time, watching them go. Then, he turned and went back to the cabin. He found her in the new room, her room. She was huddled on the small cot, her back to the door, her shoulders shaking in the silent, awful way he knew. He had defended her, but the blow had landed. The world had found her, and it had confirmed her worst fear. She's right, Clara whispered, her voice choked. You can kill men, you can build walls. It doesn't matter. She turned, her face pale and streaked with tears, her eyes hollow. To them, to the world. I'll always be a disgrace. I'll always be the woman who was sold. I'll always be the whore who lives in the mountains with a killer. I'm dirty, Elias, and I've made you dirty, too. He stood in the doorway, his large frame filling it. He looked at her, at the woman who had faced down terror, who had stitched his body, who had built this room with her bare hands, now crumpled by the words of a cold, small-minded woman. He was silent for a long time, the cabin quiet save for her muffled sobs. He walked in, not to the cot, but to the small window. He stared out at the mountains, already capped with the first snows of the season. When Mary died, he said, his voice a rough rasp, I thought that was the end of goodness. I thought God takes the good ones, the angels. She was pure. Clara, she never saw the bad in the world. She lived in a light, and the world, it don't care about angels. It breaks them. It puts them in the ground. He turned from the window. The light from it was dim, and it cast his face in shadow. He looked at her, huddled on the cot, and his eyes were burning. I don't want an angel, he said, his voice low and fierce. I looked at that woman, Martha Sutter. I looked at her, her proper life, her soul, and it was cold. It was dead. It's a lie. It's a grave. He crossed the small room in 2 strides and knelt in front of her. He put his scarred hands on her knees, his grip firm, forcing her to look at him. I want you, he said, his voice thick. I want the woman who survived a boxcar. I want the woman who cut her own hair with my knife. I want the woman who pulled me back from the ridge and stitched me up. I want the woman who is so afraid, but stays anyway. I want the woman who cries and then gets up and builds a wall. I don't want an angel. I want you, Clara, all of you, the dirty... All of it. It's real." She stopped crying. She looked at him, at his fierce, bruised face, at the honesty in his eyes. He was not just defending her. He was choosing her. He was choosing her past, her scars, her disgrace. He was choosing it over the proper world that had cast them both out. She did not speak. She reached out and pulled him to her, her hands tangling in his hair, her mouth finding his. That night, their intimacy was not the desperate, grieving collision of their first time. It was not the quiet comfort of the nights that followed. It was wild. It was untamed. It was a defiant roar against the world, against Martha Sutter, against the ghosts of Cincinnati and the graves in Illinois. It was a fire in the cold. It was two people, broken and discarded by the world, choosing each other, claiming each other. It was a raw, untamed joining that was not about comfort, but about sealing a bond that no judgment could ever break. It was a promise, made not with words, but with flesh and bone. In the morning, she woke up alone in the cot in her room. The cabin was quiet, but she could hear the gentle clink of him making coffee in the main room. The sun was streaming through her small window, illuminating the dust motes. She felt light. She felt clean. On the pillow beside her, where his head had rested, sat a small object. It was a ring. Her breath caught. She picked it up. It was carved from a piece of pine, the one he had been whittling for weeks. It was not perfect, not round. It was uneven, marked by the strokes of his knife, but he had sanded the inside smooth, so smooth it felt like silk, a simple, rough, wooden circle. Her hand was trembling. She slipped it onto the third finger of her left hand. It fit perfectly. She walked out of her room. He was at the hearth, his back to her. He did not turn. "The coffee's hot," he said. She stood there, her hand resting on the door frame, the ring visible. It's beautiful, Elias," she whispered. He just nodded once and poured her a mug. The winter came, hard and fast. It was a brutal season, the winds howling, the snow piling up over the roof. But this winter, they were not trapped. They were fortified. They had the new room. They had 2 rooms to move in. They had food she had grown and preserved, meat he had hunted. They had each other. They worked. He carved. He taught her to make snares, to read the weather in the clouds. She mended. She read to him from Sarah's Bible, not for the religion, but for the rhythm of the words in the long, dark nights. And she wrote, in the small, leather-bound journal. She began to write. She sat in her room, by the light of a candle, the wooden ring on her finger. She started, "My name is Clara." She did not write of Brogan. She did not write of the hunger. She wrote of the snow. She wrote of the feel of the axe. She wrote of the look in Elias's eyes when he'd said, "I want you." She documented her life, how she survived, how she found love in a place, and with a man that the world had deemed godless. She was, with her small stub of pencil, reclaiming her own story. One evening, as the first signs of the spring melt began to drip from the eaves, she came into the main room. Elias was at the hearth, not building the fire, but carving. He was working on the small, wooden plaque that had always hung there. She went to him, curious. "What are you?" He stepped aside, finished. He hung the plaque back on its hook. She stepped closer. She knew the names by heart. Mary Thorne, Sarah Thorne. And now there was a new name, carved just beneath his daughter's, in the same steady, careful letters. Clara. He had not carved Annie, the name of her disguise. He had carved her name, the name of the woman he had pulled from the snow. He was not replacing his family. He was adding to it. He was writing her into his history, just as she was writing him into hers. She touched the fresh carved letters. She turned to him, her face awash in quiet, cleansing tears. He was at the table, pretending to fix a strap, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. She did not need to speak. He knew. When the passes cleared, when the spring flowers, the tough, wild crocuses, pushed up through the last of the snow. They were low on supplies: salt, flour, lead. "I'm going to the post," he said. "I'm coming with you." She said it was not a request. He looked at her for a long, hard moment. He saw the woman with the short, ragged hair. He saw the wooden ring on her finger. He saw the strength that had bloomed in her, tougher than any mountain flower. He nodded. "Get your coat." It was a 2-day ride. They rode in silence. He on his mule, she on the second mule, the one that had belonged to Carver. They camped one night under the stars, his arm around her, the rifle between them. When they arrived at the trading post, it was just as she feared. It was a low, rough-hewn building with 6 or 7 men, trappers, miners, loitering on the porch. They stopped, and the men stopped talking. They stared. They stared at Elias, who they knew as the cold, silent mountain man, and they stared at her. They saw her short hair. They saw her worn, men's trousers. They saw her, a woman, arriving alone with him. Their eyes were full of judgment, of leering questions, of the same proper disgust Martha Sutter had worn. Clara froze. She felt the old shame, the familiar shrinking. She was a disgrace. She felt Elias move beside her. He did not reach for his knife. He did not stare the men down. He simply stood by his mule and waited. For her, she took a breath. She thought of the ridge. She thought of her room. She thought of her name, carved in wood, hanging by his hearth. She thought of her journal and the story she was writing. She was not a runaway. She was not a whore. She was not a victim. She was Clara. She was a survivor. She was his. She lifted her chin. She looked past the leering, judging faces, as if they were nothing more than sagebrush. She stepped out from beside the mule and walked past them, her back straight, and went through the door of the trading post, no longer ashamed. Elias Thorne, a look of grim, quiet pride on his face, followed right behind her. The late summer heat had baked the high country brown, but the nights were growing a sharp, cold edge. The promise of the next winter was already in the air. Elias and Clara worked in a new, comfortable rhythm, their shared life a quiet understanding. He was repairing the lean-to for the mules, adding a stronger windbreak, while she was in her garden, her hands in the dirt, gathering the last of the tough herbs and beans. She heard the mule first, a sound that did not belong. She was on her feet in an instant, her hand dropping to the knife at her belt. Elias had already moved, his rifle in his hand, stepping into the open. It was Jed Miller. He looked the same as he had the year before, wiry, greasy, his eyes missing nothing. He stopped his mule at the tree line. "Afternoon. Elias, ma'am," he said, nodding to Clara. "Jed," Elias replied, his voice neutral. He did not lower the rifle. "Coffee's hot. Appreciate it." Jed dismounted, but he seemed hesitant. He was not the same easy trapper. He looked at Clara, then at Elias, then at the new room and the well-tended garden. You folks look settled," he said, accepting the mug Elias passed him. "We are," Elias said. The words were flat. A warning. Jed drank the coffee, scalding hot, in one long pull. He wiped his mouth on his sleeve. "Figured you'd want to know," he said, his eyes on the ground. "I was down at the post, picked up a newspaper. 2 months old, from St. Louis." Clara went still. She felt the blood drain from her face. "It's just news," Jed said, uncomfortable. He looked at Clara. There was a man, a Mr. Brogan, shipping man, big fire on the wharf. His whole warehouse went up, him with it. Clara's hand went to the wooden ring on her finger. She could not breathe. They said he was a hard man," Jed continued, speaking to Elias now. "Owed a lot of money. The fire, they called it an accident, but folks were whispering they found him in the ruins of his office, what was left of him." He looked back at Clara, his gaze suddenly gentle. "The poster, ma'am, the one for you. It's gone. No one's asking. No one's looking. Whoever was paying Finch and Carver, he's Ash." He set the mug down on the wood pile. "Heard you had a visit from those two. Never saw them again. Good riddance." Elias nodded, his hand finally relaxing on the rifle. "We appreciate the news. Jed, ain't news." Jed said, "It's just the world turning." He backed up, grabbing his mule's reins. "You take care. Elias, ma'am." He turned and melted back into the pines, leaving them alone in the clearing. Clara stood rooted, her hand still clutching a handful of dried beans. She stared at the spot where he had been. The man, the spider, the one who had owned her, who had sold her, who had sent men to kill for her. He was gone. She was not happy. She was not sad. She was nothing. She was a puppet whose strings had just been cut, and she was left standing, hollow, not knowing how to move on her own. The fear, the constant, low-burning terror that had been her companion for years, had just been extinguished. It left a cold, empty space. Elias watched her. He saw the shock, the hollowness. He said nothing. He simply went to her, took the handful of beans from her frozen fingers, and led her inside. For 2 days, she was a ghost. She moved through the chores, her hands working, her mind 1,000 miles away. She was untethered. He let her be, giving her the space to find her footing on this new alien ground of safety. On the 3rd morning, she woke before dawn. She dressed, put on his heavy coat, and left the cabin. She did not take a mule. She just walked. She walked past the garden, past the woodpile. She took the game trail that led up. She climbed, her breath pluming in the cold air, her legs strong from a year of hard work. She climbed until she was above the tree line, on the south ridge. It was the place he had taken them, the place of the fall. She walked to the edge. The world fell away beneath her, a dizzying, vast expanse of valleys, forests, and distant, snow-capped peaks. The wind was a living thing up here. It tore at her, screaming in her ears. A wild, clean sound. It grabbed her shorn hair and whipped it across her face. She stood on the precipice, and she was not afraid. She looked out at the world. She was not a runaway. She was not a whore. She was not property. She was not even Annie. She was just Clara, a woman, standing on a mountain. The wind was so loud she did not hear him approach. She only knew he was there when his large, warm body stood beside hers, a solid break against the wind. He did not touch her. He just stood with her, looking out at the same expanse. She had defined her entire life by running from. Now, there was nothing to run from. There was only living. She looked at him, at his strong, weathered profile. He was not looking at the view. He was looking at her. "It's gone," she whispered, the wind stealing the words. "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble. I don't know what to do. I don't know who I am, if I'm not that girl." Elias turned, fully, to face her. He put his large, calloused hands on her shoulders, grounding her. "You are the woman who faced a fever," he said, his voice clear and strong over the wind. "You are the woman who planted a garden in rock. You are the woman who stitched me together. You are the woman who built a home." He looked past her, at the valley, then back to her face. His eyes were clear, and for the first time, she saw no shadows in them. "No more hiding," he said. It was not just for her. It was for him. He was done hiding from his ghosts. They were done hiding from the world. He leaned in and kissed her, not with the fire of their passion or the desperation of their grief, but with a slow, steady, certain promise. It was a kiss that tasted of the cold wind and a lifetime of mornings to come. Acceptance from the world, they learned, came not in a grand gesture, but in quiet, desperate moments. The first snow had already fallen, a light dusting that warned of the winter to come. When the knock came, it was late, the moon high, and the sound was frantic. Elias was at the door in an instant, rifle in hand. Clara was right behind him, the heavy iron skillet from the hearth in her hands. Elias opened the door a crack. "What?" It was Josiah Sutter. His face was a mask of terror in the moonlight, his thin chest heaving. "Elias! Thorne! Please!" he gasped, hat in his hands. It's my girl, Abigail. She's got the lung fever. She's burning. She can't catch her breath. The doctor's 2 days' ride, and Martha, she says the child is dying." Elias's face was hard. He remembered Martha's cold, pious judgment. "Please." Josiah wept. An awful, broken sound. I know what my Martha said. To your woman, but she's just a child. She's only 6 years old. Please, I heard they say you know. Herbs." Clara pushed past Elias. She looked at the desperate, broken man. She saw not the husband of her judge, but a father, terrified, just as Elias must have been. "Yarrow," she said, her voice sharp, clear. "Do you have yarrow?" I don't know." "Elias," she said, turning. "Get the mules. Get the bag, the one with the dried flowers, and the mint, and bring the whiskey." Elias looked at her. She was not asking. She was in command. He nodded, once, and moved. She'll come," Josiah stammered. "We'll come," Clara said. "Go, boil water, as much as you can. Keep her warm. We are right behind you." Josiah scrambled onto his wagon and whipped the mule, rattling away into the night. They rode in silence, the wind sharp, the mule's breath clouding in the cold. The Sutter homestead was a small, sad cabin in the lower valley, a patch of hard-won land. When they entered, the air was thick with the smell of sickness and fear. Martha Sutter was on her knees by a small cot, her head buried in the blankets, her body shaking. On the cot, a small girl, Abigail, was breathing in short, terrifying, whistling gasps, her face a pale blue, her skin radiating a dry heat. Martha looked up, her eyes red and wild. When she saw Clara, her face crumpled, a mask of shame and desperation. Clara did not look at her. She went to the child. "Get me the boiling water," she said to Elias. For the rest of the night, she worked. She was no longer a victim. She was a healer. She was her father's daughter. She was the mountain's apprentice. She made a tea of the yarrow and mint, forcing it, spoonful by spoonful, between the child's cracked lips. She made a poultice of herbs and whiskey, pressing it to the child's small, rattling chest. Elias sat in the corner, his rifle across his knees, a silent guardian. He watched her. He watched her gentle, certain hands. He watched her whispering to the child, low, calm words of comfort. He saw not the woman he had saved, but a woman as strong as the mountain itself. Josiah paced. Martha sat frozen, watching Clara as if she were an avenging angel. Just before dawn, the air in the cabin changed. The child's breathing, which had been a desperate whistle, hitched, then broke. A long, wet cough tore through her, then a deep, shuddering breath, and another. Clara laid her hand on the girl's forehead. The fire was gone. The skin was damp and cool. Abigail's eyes fluttered open. "Mama?" she whispered. Martha let out a sound, a choked, animal cry, and lunged forward, gathering the child in her arms. Josiah fell into a chair, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Clara stood back, exhausted, wiping her hands on her apron. Martha looked up, her face a ruin of tears and gratitude. She looked at Clara. You saved her. The fever broke," Clara said, her voice quiet. "Keep her warm. Keep giving her the tea. I... Martha stumbled to her feet. She stood before Clara, this tiny, judgmental woman, now utterly broken. What I said, I am a cold, foolish woman. I was wrong. God forgive me. You are a good woman, Clara Thorne. You are a good woman." Clara looked at her, At this woman who had caused her so much pain, she felt nothing, no anger, no triumph, just a deep, bone-weary pity. She nodded. Once. Your child is well. That is all that matters. Elias stood. He put his hand on Clara's back. We're going. As they left, Josiah ran after them. I have nothing. I have no money. We don't want your money, Elias said. But how can I repay you? Elias looked at him. Be a good neighbor, Mr. Sutter. That is all. They rode home in the cold, gray light of dawn. The meal was Elias's idea. They'll be alone for the first snows, he said a few weeks later. We have meat. You have all this. He gestured to her shelves, now groaning with jars of preserves and dried vegetables. Clara was stunned. You want them here? I want neighbors, he said. The hiding is done. They came on a cold Sunday, after the first true snowfall. They were awkward, stiff. Josiah brought a small, carved bird for Elias. Martha brought a loaf of heavy, dark bread. It was awful at first. The silence in the cabin was loud. They sat at the rough but sturdy table Elias had built. Clara served the stew. It was rich with venison and the last of her garden. Josiah cleared his throat. This is fine stew, Mrs. Thorne. Thank you, Clara said. Martha, who had been staring at her hands, looked up. I used your trick with the yarrow, my boy. He had a cough. It broke it. It's a good herb, Clara said. And just like that, the ice was broken. They talked. They did not talk of the past. They talked of the present. They talked of the winter, of trapping, of the hardness of the land, of the price of flour. They talked about life. When it was time to go, Martha paused at the door. She looked at Clara's shelves. Your berry jam, she said, pointing to the deep purple jars. I have never seen such a color. My preserves, they always go to sugar. Clara went to the shelf, took a jar, and pressed it into Martha's hands. You have to boil it fast, Clara said, her voice soft. And a little lemon, if you have it. Martha looked at the jar, then at Clara. A small, real smile touched her lips. Thank you, she said, when they were gone, and the cabin was quiet again. Elias came up behind Clara at the wash basin. He put his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. Mrs. Thorne, he said, his voice a low rumble in her ear. She leaned back against him, her hands in the warm, soapy water, and closed her eyes. She was home. The winter sealed them in. It was a good winter, not a hungry one. The cabin was warm, the new room filled with wood and supplies. They were not just surviving. They were living. One night, the snow was falling. Not a blizzard, but a soft, thick, silent fall that muffled the world, that made the cabin feel like the only place on earth. The fire was crackling. Elias was at the table, mending a harness strap, his hands strong and capable in the lamplight. Clara was by the fire, sewing one of his shirts. She stopped. She had been counting. For weeks. She had been tired, so very tired, and the smell of the salt pork in the morning. She set the shirt down. Her hand went to her belly. Elias, she said, her voice so quiet he almost did not hear it. He said, not looking up. I am late. He kept working, pulling the thread tight. Late for what? The fire. No, she said. She licked her lips, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. I am late, my monthly, by almost 2 months. The strap slipped from his hand. It clattered to the floor. He went utterly still. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes, in the firelight, were wide, shocked. He stared at her. He saw her, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terrified, hopeful question. He looked undone. The strong, solid mountain of a man looked as if he had been struck by lightning. Clara? He whispered. She nodded, a small, trembling movement. I think I am with child." He rose from the chair, but he did not stand. He stumbled. He crossed the small space between them, and he knelt. He knelt on the floor at her feet, his body trembling. He looked at her face, then at her belly. He reached out a hand, his large, scarred, trembling hand, and he laid it flat against her stomach. He felt nothing, just the warmth of her. But he knew. "Oh," he said. It was not a word. It was a sound of absolute, breaking awe. It was the sound of a man who had buried his past, his wife, his child, and had just been handed a future. He bent his head, his rough, bearded cheek pressing against her, his ear resting on her belly. He closed his eyes. A single, hot tear fell from his eye onto her hand. He was overwhelmed. He was terrified. He was happy. A happiness so profound, so large, it was painful. He stayed there, kneeling, his head resting on her, for a long, silent minute. Then he looked up, his face wrecked with emotion, his eyes shining. He took her hands. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick. He brought her hands to his lips. You will never go hungry again." He was not just talking about her. He was talking about the new life, his family, his promise. In the final scene, the winter is deep. The cabin is an island of warmth in a sea of white. Outside, the wind howls, and in the distance, the long, lonely call of a wolf pack echoes against the frozen peaks. The world is still wild, but inside, there is only peace. Clara, her body now heavy and round with the new life, sits by the fire. The light catches the smooth wood of the ring on her finger. She has her journal open on her lap. She is writing. Her shorn hair has grown, and it falls in soft, dark waves around her face. She smiles, a small, secret smile, as she writes. Across from her, in the other chair, sits Elias. He, too, is working. He is not cleaning a rifle. He is not mending a trap. In his large, scarred hands, he holds a piece of clear, pale pine. With his knife, he is carving. He is slow, his movements full of a painstaking, reverent care. He is carving the headboard of a small, rough-hewn cradle. He is carving a small, simple flower, just like the ones Clara had managed to grow in her garden. He glances up, his eyes meeting hers. He does not smile, but his gaze is full of a love so deep, it needs no expression. She smiles back and returns to her writing. She dips the pencil. She writes the last line on the page. The final words of her story. Love, when earned through survival, tastes stronger than any hunger. Thank you so much for listening to this story from all of us at From Wild West. We would love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment and let us know. Be sure to subscribe to From Wild West so you never miss a new story. And please share your thoughts on Elias and Clara's journey. We read every single one in English. We'll see you next time.